Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Pete's Vinyl and CD Review. Today, I want to go over my top 10 bands of all time. It doesn't mean it's the greatest bands of all time officially, but these are just my favorites. So when I started this channel, I wanted to get people familiar with the type of bands I liked. I do like a diverse group of bands and artists. A little bit background on me. I started really getting into music probably when I was about 5. So that would be late 70s, 1979. And then when MTV came about, I we had cable early on, and we actually were one of the first areas that had MTV. We had it right from the beginning. And if you remember back then, most of the clips they played were rock bands, either videos or concert clips. So the first couple of years of MTV was majority was rock music. So that's how I really got into it. And by the time I was 10 or 12, I knew I wanted to start playing guitar. I've been playing guitar since I was 14 in 1988, so it's about 32 years now. But over the years, I've read about so many bands and got into different types of music, mostly rock oriented, but I do listen to some instrumental music here and there. Well, like I said, these are my favorite bands, and this list could change at any point, especially the top few. So starting with number 10, this was probably the most difficult spot to pick because there could have been any one of 20 bands in number 10. But my top number 10 band is Yes. First became aware of Yes probably in 1984 or so when Owner of a Lonely Heart came out. That was around the same time I started listening to classic rock radio. Growing up in the area I'm in, New Jersey, there was a lot of New York stations that played classic rock. Then I started to hear their older music, and at that point started collecting their albums. I've only seen Yes live once, which was on the Union tour, where they had basically the members of the two classic lineups, Trevor Rabin, Steve Howe, and then Alan White, Bill Buford, Tony Banks, and Rick Wakeman, along with Chris Squire and John Anderson. So that concert was in the round too. I think it's the only in the round concert I've ever seen. But since then, I have collected most of their albums. I don't have a lot of their newer albums that they made in the 90s after John Anderson came back. But I'm familiar with most of their catalog and have quite a few on vinyl. I just thought it was easier to pull the CDs of the bands I liked and pull the records out and then have to refile them, etc. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Number 9. This might be surprising to some people. But my number 9 favorite band is Dakin. Dakin a lot of times get labeled as a hair metal band, which obviously they were out in that time period. But to me, Dakin were always a little more musically and lyrically better than most bands out at the time. George Lynch, one of the best guitar players of the 80s, and their songs were really great, and they weren't about the typical sex, drugs, rock and roll as some of the other bands from this era. They sang about more mature relationships, say, and they sang a lot about nuclear war at the time, even. So they were borderline. They did have some songs that were more borderline metal, like Tooth and Nail, Till the Living End, things like that. And they also had the more commercial-oriented material. But their first 5 albums, including Dysfunctional, their reunion album, I think are really good. I've only heard bits and pieces of them since then. Shadow Life was the last album I got from them, and I wasn't too impressed with that. It was more of a not grunge influenced album, but definitely toned down, and there wasn't many solos on it. But yeah, if you ever haven't heard Dakin and you just think they're just a hair metal band, definitely check them out. Next band coming up is probably a band you've heard a lot of lately because of Neil Peart passing, and that's Rush. Again, this is one of the bands I first saw on MTV early on. In the early days, they used to show actually concert clips of Tom Sawyer and Red Barchetta, and I think they did have a video for Limelight actually, but early on, they were one of the bands that MTV played constantly because they didn't have any content. Later in the 80s, I started getting their albums. Don't have many on vinyl, actually. Actually, I did have Moving Pictures at one point on vinyl. But all of them I have are on CD. And I don't have all of their albums, and I'm familiar with pretty much all of their catalog. And the only albums I don't really care for too much are some of the later ones, like Vapor Trails. And Presto. Presto is probably the least favorite album I've heard from them. But overall, definitely one of the great bands of all time. Consistent musicianship is off the charts, and they were always there. They never had a blockbuster selling album, but they always consistently had a gold selling album. They always played arenas, and they were always there during all the changes of rock. So, definitely one of my favorites. Moving along. This is now number 7, and it's the Kinks. I first became a Kinks fan probably in the early 80s. Actually, no, probably around 1983, which was when Come Dancing came out, maybe. And at the time, they were another band that had a lot of videos on MTV. This was during their sort of arena rock era. And as time grew on, I got to hear some of their more classic music. Didn't realize at the time that they were the ones who sang You Really Got Me and All Day of the Night. And eventually started hearing a lot of their older albums. Probably the late 80s, I started buying their albums on CD, maybe even cassette at the time. So they have their 60s period, which is sort of like their British invasion period, and then they went into their late 60s era, which is more of not a folky era, but it's when they started getting into concept albums. And I've gone back and I've heard pretty much all of them, and I'm a big fan of pretty much all of their albums. The only one I don't like is Preservation Act 2. I think that album is more of one of those concept albums that has songs written for the story as opposed to a bunch of good songs. But other than that, I like all eras of the band. I think Ray Davies is one of the greatest songwriters of all time. Definite influence on all types of hard rock. And, they were always great live. I think Ray Davies is one of the most underrated performers live. So, which brings me to the next band, The Who. So The Who also was one of those bands that I heard first in the early 80s on MTV. They had a few videos for the Face Dances album. And I believe the first Who song I heard probably was You Better You Bet, when that was actually a hit at the time. I was probably, I don't know if that was 1980 or 81, but I was probably 6 or 7 at the time. So I definitely was a fan since then, and which that era of The Who, most Who fans don't like too much, but it's probably one of my favorite eras of the band because I think those two albums are probably really good. It's Hard and Face Dances. But again, Pete Townsend as a songwriter is one of my favorite songwriters, and I don't think there's a Who album I don't like too much except their last one, Endless Wire. To me, that album is just fragmented songs. There's not even too many songs that are over 2 minutes on that album, and I just did not get into it that much. But after their last album came out called Who, which I like very much, and I'll be doing a review of that one soon. I'm going to go back and listen to Endless Wire again to see. I saw them once live in 2002, which I'm glad I did because that was the short window of time between when they had sort of like a big band era and then they started adding more musicians after that. I saw them a couple weeks after John Entwistle actually passed away, so they only had a keyboard player and I believe Pete's brother on additional guitar. So it was basically 6 guys. After that, they started adding more and more. If you see clips of them live now, they have background singers and 2 or 3 keyboard players. It's really sort of overblown. I preferred them, and I saw them in the Garden, and they were loud as hell, but they were really good, and I'm glad I saw them at that time period. The next band, definitely one of the great heavy metal bands of all time, Iron Maiden. First became aware of them probably around 1983, 84. I used to see their videos early on in MTV, Number of the Beast, Flight of Icarus, and I was kind of scared of them at first. They were a little heavier than most of the music I was listening to at the time, but once I got to be like 10, 11, 12, I really started to get into them. I have most of their albums except their last couple. Not crazy about the Blaze Bayley era. I have those albums. There's some good songs on there. I actually saw them live in a small club. It was packed like sardines in there. And seen them live several times with Bruce Dickinson. Actually, I saw them when they came back with him in Brave New World Tour. But my favorite albums from them are probably the first 2. In my band in high school, we used to play almost all the songs from the first 2 albums. They're really, every song on there is killer, and along with Number of the Beast, obviously. But yeah, they're not the typical heavy metal band. They don't sing about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They're more about a lot of their song titles and are either book or movie-based song titles. And they write about all types of wars and kings and and that type of thing, but the musicianship and the guitar players have always been great. And again, another band with a loyal fan base. They still to this day play arenas in the US and they play stadiums all around the world. Okay. Next band up, number 4, Alice Cooper. First became aware of him probably in sometime when I was a kid in the late 70s. I probably had not heard any of his music, but I was aware of who he was. Then around the same time I started really getting into music, I picked up one of his albums just on a hunch, I think because one of my friends was really into him. And at that point was just blown away. I think the first album I got from him was actually a live album called The Alice Cooper Show, which was on his Lace and Whiskey tour. Since then, I don't own all of his albums, but I've heard all of his albums. The first 2 were kind of odd. They were on Frank Zappa's label. But Love It to Death, starting from there, all the way even through Lace and Whiskey, I think are really good albums. Not always hard rock. He was sort of incorporated some vaudeville and almost comical at times. As he got towards the late 70s, he went into a period where he released 4 albums that were sort of, I don't want to say obscure, but at this point Alice said he doesn't even remember recording them. And he even went through a new wave period. Flush the Fashion and Special Forces sort of have that new wave feel to them, but they're still great. Not so much of a fan of Hey Stupid. Trash is a pretty good album overall. Hey Stupid is okay, but I was a pretty big fan of Brutal Planet when it came out. Pretty heavy album. Pretty good release at the time. Moving on to number 3. Cheap Trick. Again, there's another band early in the early days of MTV, they were played constantly. So MTV debuted in 1981, and I could remember seeing the Dream Police video several times a day, and that song was already a couple years old, along with "I Want You to Want Me" and some of the other songs that they had videos for. And then all throughout the 80s, they always had, seemed like a hit from each album. "Tonight It's You." Then they came back with "The Flame." Probably around that time is when I started collecting their albums, and I sort of drifted off for a while. Then they came out with an album called "Woke Up with a Monster," was really good. Back to a hard rock sound, and I saw them in concert at that time. And at that point is when I started collecting all their albums. I have every Cheap Trick album. Some love more than others, but again, another band that consistently has put out good music from the start, and continue to. And they're still a great live band. And they're one of those bands that can't be categorized really as, are they hard rock, are they punk, they're all of that, which is maybe why they never really broke big. The only thing that annoys me kind of like about them is the last few summers they've been opening for other bands. So this summer they're opening for Rod Stewart, which I have no interest in seeing Rod Stewart. I wish they would just play theaters on their own, really, and did their own shows. I know they do their own shows, but it seems like in this area lately they haven't done their own shows. They're just opening for other acts. Moving on to number 2. My number 1 and 2 could be switched at any time because they're really the two bands that I've loved from the start, really. Number 2 is Van Halen. I debated about this, whether they're my favorite band, because Eddie Van Halen is my favorite guitar player of all time. First heard Van Halen probably again in 1981 on MTV. They had that live video for Unchained. I was just blown away at the end where Alex Van Halen lights his gong on fire and starts, and they were just unbelievable. Then when 1984 came out, that's when I really became a super fan of theirs. And from then on, really he was the inspiration for me to start playing guitar. And they put out a live video called "Live Without a Net" after 5150. I watched that video probably every day for a couple years, and have been a huge fan of theirs ever since. Have all their albums. Again, one of those bands that were able to survive in the 90s. I think there's probably 3 bands that were labeled as 80s bands that were able to survive into the 90s: Metallica, Van Halen, and Bon Jovi. It's really a shame that they fired Sammy Hagar in '96, because I think they could have continued and been a pretty big band. But I'll probably have another video about Van Halen in the future. So, again, my number 1 band is probably no secret. It's Kiss. This is actually the first CD I ever got. And I believe it was 1986. And this was the first album I ever had. It was 5 years old, and my cousin gave me a copy of this album on cassette, which was pretty odd, having a cassette even in 1979. Most people had records. But anyway, I played that cassette till it broke. And I've been a huge Kiss fan ever since. I have every album. I've seen them multiple times live. And now even my son, who's 10, is a big Kiss fan. So there's nothing else to say. Either you love Kiss or you hate them. I know most people who are into classic rock think they're sort of a joke. They've never been played on classic rock too much besides Rock and Roll All Night. But I love all eras of the band. There's only a couple albums I really don't like too much, but yeah, definitely one of the great bands of all time. They're probably the greatest American band of all time, whether you want to admit it or not. So I'll probably have some more about Kiss in the future shows. So I just wanted to list some other bands that I was a big fan of, but didn't make my top 10. And these first 3 probably could at any time work it into my top 10. First band is Metallica. Was a huge Metallica fan in the 80s, all the way even through the 90s. they're just not a band I listen to very often anymore. I even liked Load and Reload a lot. I know a lot of people hate those albums, but I think it's just I don't think about listening to them anymore because I listened to them so much early on, and they were a bands I was in high school. We covered them constantly, and I guess as it's over time, that you don't some of the bands you don't love them any less. You just don't listen to them as much. And they were one of the few really, really heavy bands I listened to. Frank Zappa, huge fan of Frank Zappa. The Beatles, Joan Jett, Twisted Sister, Queensryche, King's X, Dream Theater, Joe Satriani, Jimi Hendrix, Weezer, Judas Priest, The Cars, Toto, Blondie. I was a big Blondie fan early on. Probably that first woman I thought that was really hot. Last 10 years I've become a big Steely Dan fan. Deep Purple and Heart. But those are not limited to all the bands I like. But that's just a small group of bands that at least I'm collecting. I was a huge Queensryche fan too at one time. Loved all their albums through probably the 90s. The last couple they did with Jeff Tate I was not impressed with. And it's clear why he left the band. I haven't heard... I've heard the last two with Todd Latour, and to me they just sounded like a generic heavy metal band at this point. Not that it's bad, it's just that they don't have that Queensryche sound. Without Chris DeGarmo and Jeff Tate, I think you have to have one of them in the band to have that Queensryche sound. So now I'm going to move on to recent finds or pickups that I've had. And usually most of the albums I get are from... There's a couple record stores in New Jersey. I'm lucky that we have this area. In this area, we have a lot of good record stores. So there's the Princeton Record Exchange, Vintage Vinyl, Man Cave in Bordentown, and they have a record collector there. But there's also a lot of Goodwills and thrift stores that I find albums for real cheap. And I'm not a guy that likes to collect the reissues so much. Only if there's something on it that maybe didn't come out originally. I just like to find an original copy of something. And plus, I think the reissues are kind of pricey. $25 for an album, to me, is kind of crazy at this point. It's almost the way CDs were super expensive in the 80s, $17, $18, and then the albums were like $9 or $10. Now they've reversed it. I know a lot of them are limited edition, and that's fine. But anyway, so recent pickups for CDs. The latest 2 album. I won't get into this much because I'm going to do a review of this on a separate video, but this is the Target version with 3 extra songs on it. Would have got this on vinyl probably, but hey, the CD had 3 extra songs. And I just found out the other day, which kind of annoyed me, there's a Japanese version, I think, that has another song called Sand that's not on this. I really hate when bands do that. I hate when bands have multiple special editions of their albums. Like, you're already buying one special edition, now I'm going to have to buy another one for that. And I didn't get this on vinyl because this special edition with the 3 extra songs was like $50 or $60 or something. So, because I think it came with the CD also. So, I'm happy with the CD. And, again, I'll do a review of this soon. Next one is a CD I saw in the thrift store. Picked it up for $1. Always heard about this album, but had never heard it except for the one song called Wild Dogs, and that's Tommy Bolin teaser. Tommy Bolin, probably best known as Ritchie Blackmore's replacement in Deep Purple. He did one album with them, Come Taste the Band, and several live albums from that tour have come out. And I have one of them called Last Concert in Japan, where he played horribly. He was screwed up, either on heroin, or it could be the concert that supposedly he slept on his arm and he fell asleep, and then the next day had to play a concert. So I actually have to go back and listen to that one also to see how it is. But this album's really good. It's actually not an instrumental album. I think there's 2 instrumentals on here, but the album is really good, and his playing is great on it. And he also played on the last two James Gang albums. I haven't heard those, but I will definitely pick up some more Tommy Bolin when I see it. Next one is Michael Bolton. Yes, the Michael Bolton. So, if a lot of you don't know, Michael Bolton's first two solo albums were actually hard rock albums. This one and the next one called Everybody's Crazy. This one has Bruce Kulick from Kiss on it, and also Bob Kulick on guitar. Haven't not listened to this one yet, so when I do, I'll let you know how it is. But I just wanted to pick up this one and the next one because of Bruce was on guitar. And he also was in a band called Blackjack with Bruce, which came out with 2 albums also. And he did put out 2 albums, or 2 or 3 albums in the 70s under his real name, Michael Bolitini. I think those are more folk or acoustic based. But we will see how this is. As far as records, first one is a Record Store Day exclusive. It's Freely's Comet. It was recorded live in England. It has 6 live songs on it. I believe these are the same songs that are on a compilation he put out about 15 or 20 years ago called 12 Picks. Unfortunately, this is not the lineup with Anton Fig. This is the lineup with Jamie Aldaker on drums. They did one album with him, Second Sighting, and this is the tour for it. So I think this is the same, might be the same concert that they did that live plus 4 video on. It's on orange vinyl. And I picked this up because I picked up one for my son for Christmas, so I figured I'd pick up one for myself. And it sounds pretty good, and it's just cool to have. Again, this is one of sort of a reissue that I picked up just because it's exclusive to vinyl. Next one is, again, another Kiss one. This is Destroyer Resurrected. It was a Walmart exclusive on orange vinyl. This was put out on CD a couple, maybe 10 years ago. It was remixed by Bob Ezrin, and you can see even the cover's different. They have their live outfits. This was the original painting because they didn't have their Destroyer costumes out at the time they did the cover. The drums and some of the other instruments are a little bit more up front. Other than that, it's not much of a difference. The song Sweet Pain was the song that Dick Wagner played the solo on. And on the CD, original CD, the one where Ace played the solo was the bonus track. This one just has the track with Ace plays the solo, which I think it's pretty good. I don't know why it was replaced by Dick Wagner to begin with. The only thing about this, I don't think it sounds that good. And I've heard other people comment too. It's on orange vinyl. It's limited to, I think, 5,000 copies. But was not impressed with the sound. So, again, this is just one to sort of collect. Next one is picked up the other day at Salvation Army. It's a solo album by Daryl Stuermer. If you don't know, he is Genesis and Phil Collins' touring guitar player. So I saw this at Salvation Army for $1. And I never knew he even had a solo album. So I have not listened to this yet, but the record is like in mint condition. So we'll see how it is. And last one I picked up the same day. Oh, actually not the last one. Is by an artist called Fiona. She was sort of like a hard rock, heavy metal artist. Later on, I think she had somewhat of a minor hit or video with a song with Kip Winger. But this one, I think this is her first solo album. And it's a promo copy. And the cover's got some wear on it, but the record itself is mint. I haven't listened to it yet, but it's produced by Pepe Marcello from the Good Rats, and also Joe Franco from the Good Rats plays drums on it. So sort of has a New York connection, and so I'll listen to it and let you know how it is. Last one is one I had picked up a while ago, I think, at pawn shop near me for $1 or $2. It's Louis Reed Rock and Roll Animal. This is not an original pressing. I looked it up, and I think this one is from 1980. So originally this had a gatefold. But again, I looked at the record, and it was in mint condition. And this era of Lou Reed is probably the only era I really like, this and Transformer. And I had heard this album years ago, probably 20 years ago, and I always wanted to pick it up. So there it was sitting one day in a pile of other crap that nobody wants. So, just real quick, when I get albums, I clean them. I store them in a plastic sleeve on the outside. And what I use are the MoFi sleeves for the inside. And I really like these because I believe they create less static and protect the album. And it also protects the original inner sleeve. You know, if you sit there and you take out a sleeve in and out of a record, eventually that sleeve will get worn and it creates more dust on the record. So I sleeve all my albums in the MoFi sleeves, or whatever they're called. Kind of expensive, but about a year ago I did my whole collection. It cost a lot at first, but now as I get the albums, I just put them in there one by one. So, okay, so thanks a lot, and my next video should be up in a day or two. Subscribe and tell your friends. Thanks.